Hello, everyone, and welcome to our Empowering Elite Athlete Education Symposium. My name's Chris Lawrence. I'm the Director of One Wellbeing and a professional athlete as well. Just a couple of housekeeping things before we get started. Can everyone just make sure that their microphones are on mute and that their cameras are off? And I'll introduce our other guests. So with us today, we've also got Leon Kidd, the Director of One Wellbeing, and from Western Sydney University, we've got Sam Lane and Dr. Neil Hall. So Neil, I'll throw it over to you to begin our symposium.
Thanks, Chris, and good afternoon and welcome to this webinar on empowering athlete education. My name is Dr. Neil Hall. I'm Director of Program for Social Work and Director of Men's Health Information Resource Centre here at WSU. I'd first like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands on which we're all meeting. I'm coming to you from the beautiful Blue Mountains of Sydney, whose traditional owners are the Darug and Gundungurra nations. I want to thank them for their hospitality, safe transit, and the ways in which we can learn as partners in this world. I want to pay respect to elders past and present and also extend that respect to all First Nations people who have joined us today. This afternoon is one step in an exciting partnership developed between Western Sydney and One Wellbeing. When we first connected with each other almost 2 years ago, I immediately got excited about the potential for collaborating on research into this topic area. The webinar today will be a highlights package, but very soon you'll be able to read the full paper in the International Journal of Sport and Society. Research is an extremely vital cog in understanding athletes' needs and the organisational and support context in which they operate. Research also helps us to confirm those suspicions we have about what works and what doesn't work, and helps us to develop benchmarks for best practice. Currently, there's an exciting range of research being done across the board at Western Sydney Uni in partnership with community-based and professional sports organisations. Researchers here have strong links with GWS Giants, Western Sydney Wanderers, Parramatta Eels, Panthers on the Prowl, Canterbury Bankstown Bulldogs, Cricket Australia, Cricket Victoria, Tennis Australia, the National Rugby League, Netball Australia, and North Melbourne AFL Club. So we're well invested in researching into the area of sport. The scope of our research focuses on areas around the management and use of sport as a vehicle to foster a variety of community outcomes, such as player wellbeing, men's health, social cohesion, inclusion, gender equity, prevention of domestic violence, international diplomacy, and group mentoring of young males. You can see the priority that we place on research, and we hope that your excitement for the potential of research is also growing. I'm excited that so many people representing such a wide variety of sporting bodies and clubs have been able to join us today. Now, maybe you've been sitting on your own idea for a year or so, not knowing how or where to start. Well, if so, then you're in the right place. You'll hear today about one project in detail, and we'll also have the opportunity, I think, to build some strong networks for how we might be able to work together in the future. Right now, what I'd like to do is hand back to Chris Lawrence, who's going to tell us a bit about his distinguished career and the vital importance that education has played in his journey. Yes.
Thank you, Neil. Thank you very much for that. Hello again, guys. For those who don't know much about me, my name's Chris Lawrence. I'm a professional athlete. I've played 15 years of professional rugby league for the West Tigers. I've played over 240 first grade games. Looking forward to hopefully rallying at that tally a bit more once we get back into the swing of things in a couple of weeks' time. I've also been fortunate enough to play 6 test matches for Australia, and I've also represented the city side in the city versus country fixture. I grew up always loving rugby league. As a young kid and starting playing at 5 years of age, all I wanted to do was play in the NRL, to be honest. There's nothing else I really wanted to do. Although in saying that, I did still pursue interests at primary school and at high school. I was always wanting to learn and be better, but I think that was probably more out of competitiveness and trying to be the best I could be and better than others in my class, to be honest. I attended St Gregory's High School at Campbelltown, which is a renowned rugby league school. And as soon as I got there, there's two things I wanted to do. The first was to play first grade for St Gregory's College, which a lot of rugby league players have gone on from first grade in the NRL. And my second dream was to then go on and play in the NRL. Little did I know that in 2006, and when I was only 17 years of age, I'd be thrown in the limelight and I'd make my debut in the NRL for the West Tigers against Brisbane Broncos at Suncorp Stadium. It was a very surreal experience. I only found out a few days before the game that I would be playing, and the game happened to be one day before my trial HSC exam, so it was quite a hectic time. Fortunately enough, I was able to not only score a try during that game, but we were able to get the win. That really changed my life, that moment. Flying home that night, it was a whirlwind. I remember sitting on the plane on the way home next to one of my teammates, and given I had done fairly well at school and I was still quite motivated, got my study books out, and one of the players next to me turned around and said, "What are you doing? Put those away. You've won your first NRL game, mate. Enjoy yourself." But I was lucky. As soon as we landed from the plane, I had good people around me, like my parents, my close family and friends, who told me to make sure that I would switch on tomorrow for my HSC trial exam, because they told me not to wait for the hard work that I put in over the last couple of years. They said that football could last. You don't know how long football's going to last at any moment. And this was advice that was given to me early on. I remember coming to school that next day, and as you can see in the picture right here, it was quite a hectic experience. I've gone from someone who was unknown to everyone, to being thrust on the back of the Daily Telegraph. And for me, it was something that I wasn't very comfortable with. I didn't really like the limelight or the media. I went on to play the rest of the games that year, the next 5 games. And again, being a young teenage player, still at high school and doing HSC, got a lot of media attention, which I wasn't comfortable with. So for me, it was a good escape to really focus on my trial HSC exam. Yes, I did it because my parents told me I had to keep making sure I don't waste it, but I found it as a really good escape to get away from the media pressure. Fortunately enough, the next year, because I finished my HSC and I found it as a really good escape, I decided to enroll into a university degree as I went into my second year of football. I found it a really good way to, again, take my focus away from the media attention. So I thought, well, if it worked for me the previous year, why not continue the trend? So I enrolled into an exercise and sports science degree and was accepted into Sydney University. Unfortunately, my first university experience wasn't the best one. I struggled to be able to attend a lot of the lectures and tutorials, and just unfortunately at the time there wasn't a lot of flexibility. I struggled to keep up because of the lack of support and the lack of attendance at certain classes. I came to a head in the end of the first year where I was selected in the kangaroo tour for the junior kangaroos under 19 side, and I had an assignment that was due a day after I got back. And I was away for 2 weeks. So I went and spoke to the unit coordinator to see if I could get an extension. She only gave me a couple of days. So not wanting to argue, I thought, okay, I went on the tour, did as best I could, came home, had 2 days to finish the assignment. Given I hadn't been at a lot of lectures or tutorials, didn't have a lot of notes. Fortunately, I had some friends who were doing the course who lent me their notes. In a rush, doing the assignment, I did all the assignment myself, went to hand in, realised I didn't have certain graphs and diagrams which needed to be included. So I've gone and used the diagrams and of those from the notes that I had, which obviously weren't mine and were of my friends that have used it. So long story short, got pulled up for plagiarism and told that I was in danger of getting kicked out. So for me, this put a really bad taste in my mouth. It wasn't something that it really sat well with me. I felt like I was doing the right thing and I was being punished because of my schedule and the demands of elite sport. So that's probably one of the main reasons why I'm so passionate about athlete education, because that first university experience really left a bad taste in my mouth. And I've really had a passion for learning. I found it really helped me in my initial years of playing rugby league. And I really was passionate about it because I didn't want anyone, myself included, to have to go through that. I thought surely there was a way that athletes wouldn't be punished for having, changing demands in training schedules. Surely there was a better way that athletes could, if they wanted to learn, could be able to learn. I've since gone on and started our own business with Leon Keir, One More Being, and that's what we've done over the last 6 to 8 years. We've tried to find ways in which we can find positive outcomes with education for athletes. I've since gone on to continue my studying, completing a certificate 3 and 4 in fitness, as well as going on to complete a Bachelor of Commerce through Open Universities. Now I'm still 2 subjects away. I'm glad it's very flexible, because the changing demands of not only running a business, now having a young family, and playing elite sport means you need that flexibility and support. Every setback is preparing you for a moment that hasn't happened yet. Now, this was a quote that was told to me quite early on in my career, and it didn't really make a lot of sense at the time, to be honest. I was going through a couple of small setbacks, but wasn't really aware of its significance. In 2011, in round 3, and only 5 months after I'd made my debut for Australia, I dislocated my hip in a regular run in rugby league. Was caught in a tackle, was twisted awkwardly, and dislocated my hip. Still to this day, I'm not sure how that actually happened, but to say it was painful is quite an understatement. I remember being stretchered off, as you can see here, into the dressing sheds and then taken off to hospital. My hip was out for 2.5 hours. I had to be sedated and put under to be able to put the hip joint back in, and it took about 5 or 6 doctors and nurses to be able to put it back in. Surgeons likened it to a car accident. They said they'd rarely seen such an injury within rugby league. The next day, I remember, there was so much unknown. I didn't know how long I was going to be out for, what the prognosis was. I was watching Fox Sports News, and they were talking about our doctor being interviewed by one of the Fox Sports reporters, who said that this could be potentially the end of my career, because if the hip was out for longer than 2.5 hours, there would be complications which would require me to get a hip replacement. Now, this was the first time I was hearing this, and for someone at the age of 22 and going into the prime of their career, you can imagine how this played with my mind. The uncertainty, really ate away at me. I remember seeing my physio the next day, and I said to him, "Look, what's the fastest anyone's ever come back from a hip dislocation?" And he said, "Oh, I'm not sure, maybe 3 months." And he said, "But you know that you still have to wait until 3 months before you get a scan to clear you of this condition, which would lose your blood flow." So for me, I just was not in a really good headspace, being 22 years of age, and there are a lot of unknowns, and not knowing whether my career would be over for another 3 months. So for me, I had to take my focus away from all that uncertainty and things I couldn't control. So the 2 things I did was set small targets and little goals, which I could achieve with all my training and my rehabilitation. And then I thought, well, what's something I can do? So that's when I started to enroll in my Bachelor of Commerce degree. I had to focus on study and education. I found that as a really good escape from all the uncertainty that was going on within my football career. So eventually I started working my way back, and every day I would get up, go to training, meet the targets I would have set myself, or the physios would set for me, would achieve those. I would leave and I would go focus on study. And I did this over and over again until eventually I was given the all clear, and I was told that I could come back and make my comeback from football. So for me, that really cemented to myself that if you had to focus away from sport, you can really get rid of the negative thinking. You can get rid of the uncertainty that comes along with elite sport, and particularly injuries. So for me, I thought this is a way that I can overcome any injury that's thrown at me for the rest of my career, because it's allowed me to come back in just over 3 months, so almost record time. And for me, I didn't do anything different. I just focused on little targets on the field and things I could do with my rehab. But then I completely removed myself as a football player and just focus on study, focus on education, focus on developing myself away from the field. And that really kept me in a good headspace, which allowed me to get back in that time period. As I said before, every setback is preparing you for a moment that hasn't happened yet. And it was only really until February of 2019 where I truly understood the significance of this quote. In a regular training run, about 2 days out from our first trial game in 2019 in New Zealand, I had a head clash and suffered a major facial injury in which I broke 12 bones in my face. I eventually needed surgery, which required 8 plates to be put in my face from a facial reconstruction. As I talked about with my hip injury, yes, that was definitely painful. This was different. It was painful, but there was a moment not long after I'd injured myself when I thought things could really go pear-shaped. I had a head clash, and at the time there was actually an ambulance strike in New Zealand. So I was sitting there laying on the field for 20 minutes waiting for an ambulance when the physio kept putting it off, saying, "I don't know how long until the ambulance is going to come, mate." Because I had so much internal bleeding, I really had struggled to breathe. I thought, you know what, if I really panic here, yeah, I'm in trouble. So I had to really focus on my breathing, one breath at a time, in and out. Eventually, an hour later, the ambulance came, rushed me off to hospital. And again, I was there told by surgeons, like deja vu, that this was something more likened to a car accident that not many surgeons had ever seen before in a sporting injury. And again, it felt like deja vu. I wasn't told any return date. I wasn't told whether I could return at all. There was so much unknown. I wasn't told anything for the first couple of days. Yeah, again, the uncertainty started to eat away at me. It really culminated in the second day after I did the injury, where my wife flew over to New Zealand from Australia to be by my side. She walked in the room, saw my face, and just burst out crying. And the first thing she said was, "You're never playing rugby league again." And I said, "Oh, look, yeah, okay. I said, "Oh, well, if the surgeons give me the okay and I get the green light, I'll see. Maybe I'll have a crack." And about 2 or 3 days later, because of the uncertainty again, I started getting a really bad mindset. And then it just clicked with me. I'd already been shown a blueprint about how to overcome this injury. Everything I'd learned from my previous setbacks and how to apply myself have really taught me how to get through this tough period. So here's a picture of me 3 days after the incident, sitting in a hospital in New Zealand, jumping on my iPad and getting back into my university work. Also working with One Wellbeing. You know, I had a blueprint. It had worked for me before, and every subsequent injury I'd had, it had worked for me. It had taken the focus away from things that I couldn't control, because, you know, as in elite sport, you have ups and downs. It's like a roller coaster. And if you spend too long thinking about all those things, it really wears away at you. So for me, I kept focusing on the things that were in my control until eventually I could make my comeback. I had surgery, you know, I had good days and my bad days. On my good days, I would get up, I'd do what I had to do, focus on my rehab. I would then apply myself with my education, my study, and my work within my business. But then I did have my bad days. I remember this culminated in a point where about 6 weeks after my surgery, and my face was completely different. And I was really down about myself. For me, I felt like your face is like your identity. And I'd look in the mirror every morning and I felt like I lost a part of my identity. So I was frustrated and angry. I rang up the surgeon. I went to go see the surgeon. I thought, he's done a terrible job. He hasn't done it properly. And, you know, all these negative thoughts started going through my head. I remember leaving that surgery appointment and didn't really feel any better, but walked into the lift. And as I was going down to the lift, there was a woman coming in with a child at the hospital where I was visiting the surgeon. And the child had a drip in his arm and was laughing and joking with his mum. And for me, it just flipped everything and put things into perspective for me. I started thinking, what am I carrying on about? I just had to reset. I thought, I've got my health, I've got my family, I've got my friends, and I can still apply myself and I can still grow myself away from sport. From that day forward, it really shifted my mindset to get back on track and apply the blueprint, which has worked so well for me in the past. So that's what I did. After 5 long months of being out, and after, you know, plenty of painful experiences, I made my return to the field, and I was able to prove so many people wrong. You know, doctors, coaches, surgeons, so many people doubted me and thought I couldn't come back. But I knew, because I had a blueprint that I've learnt from the start of my career of how to take your mind away from everything that's going on with elite sport. Elite sport's a roller coaster. The highs are so good, but the lows are really low. You know, whether that's form, whether that's going through contract, whether it's going through injury, which I have. So for me, I found applying yourself and having a focus away from sport and focusing on education can really take your mind away from everything. I found it as a massive escape, and a massive escape not only from the media attention that I didn't really want at the start of my career, towards a massive escape for me and the uncertainty with all the major injuries that I've had throughout my career. I wouldn't be able to be sitting here and talking to you today and talking to you as a current elite athlete and still playing if it wasn't for education. And I truly believe that. I wouldn't have been able to come back from those major setbacks, and I wouldn't be still playing after 15 years if I didn't have education or a focus away from sport to develop myself. So that's one of the second reasons why I'm so passionate about this, and why I want to share my knowledge with all athletes and everyone associated within athlete education. So on that note, I'll pass over to Leon Q.
So Chris's story highlights the importance and the positive impact education can have on athletes and their lives. But Chris is the exception. And through my experience over the last 9 years in helping athletes build confidence in education, Chris really falls in the 1% of athletes. So then what if an athlete hates to learn, hates education? What if they associate education in a negative way? Until I was 20 years old, I would go even far to say that I was scared of reading and writing. For me, this fear started when I was 8 years old. I remember sitting down, trying to read a book to my dad, and I couldn't even read the first word, the. I don't have many negative memories when I was younger, but I do remember exactly how I felt this day, hopeless. All through my schooling, my learning ability, I just wanted to be invisible inside a classroom. But into my best efforts, I was always found. And teacher would say, Leon, stand up and read this to class. Yeah, I would stand up petrified and absolutely struggle through a reading. And the most frustrating thing for me was that I can read, but for some reason, when I had to read to others, I just froze. Yeah, this experience at school really deflated me mentally, and it wasn't from my overachieving efforts as an athlete. I think it really would have broken me. But lucky I had sport as my outlet and a way to really bring up my self-worth. At the age of 15, I signed my first contract with the Cronulla Sharks, and I gave up on school. Now, I share this story with you today because this is a story that I share and I have shared for the last 9 years as my icebreaker when I start working with athletes on our orientation day. After sharing this story, I ask athletes to stand up if they can relate to me. I've only ever had 4 athletes stay seated. 4 out of 407 athletes. That's less than 1%. My passion for learning started when I enrolled into a fitness course. As an athlete, because I was surrounded by fitness, instead of books to learn, I used my experience and my network to learn. Because I was confident in fitness for the first time, I became confident in learning. Now, this way of learning I know is not conventional, but it works for me, and it continues to work for me for the last 12 years. After finishing my fitness course, my newfound confidence in education, I learned how to write a business plan, and it is with this business plan, Chris and I started One More Being. For the past 12 years, One More Being has inspired, empowered, and educated. And my purpose since transitioning out of sport is to help athletes find their confidence in learning. I really believe everyone learns differently. And by working towards people's strengths, we can build confidence in education with anyone. In 2006, Sir Kevin Robertson presented a TED Talk. Since speaking this talk, he's had over almost 60 million views. And it was Sir Kevin that really started this conversation about individual education for learners. So how do we individualize education for athletes? At the heart of every qualification, it doesn't matter if you're at school, university, TAFE or college, there's a document called a TAS, a training and an assessment strategy. The only way that we can really individualize education is by creating a TAS that is focused on athletes. In 2016, Chris and I started conducting a research report into elite athlete education. My first interview was with former Rupa General Manager of Player Development, Rosemary Towner. A 30-minute survey turned into a 90-minute discussion and collaboration. Walking away from that meeting, I had tingles down my spine because I knew we had started something special. I then spent the next 3 years trying to speak to as many PDMs, wellbeing managers, athletes as I possibly could. And as time went on, and after I collected the data, the pictures just became clearer and clearer and clearer. At the end of 2018, Chris and I privately published our findings, and I thought it would only be fitting to share it with Rosemary first, as this is where my journey started. After presenting to Rosemary, she insisted I seek academic publication, and this confidence plan has seated in my mind, and for the next 2 months, Chris and I shared our research with as many people as we possibly could, with the hope that the right person will listen and our academic publication could be achieved. Our plan worked, and in February last year, I was introduced to Sam Lane and Dr. Neil Hall. Within 2 weeks, Neil approved our publication. All my data and notes were handed over to Sam, and 5 months later, here we are today. Confidence is the key to success. And if you have confidence, you can achieve anything. I promise you that. So I'm going to pass you over to Sam Lane now, and he's really going to dive deep into our research into empowering elite athlete education. Sam, over to you, mate.
Thanks, Leon. Hello, everyone, and good afternoon. My name's Sam Lane, and I'm a PhD candidate from Western Sydney University and a researcher for the Parramatta Eels. And I'm one of the 4 authors of the paper that I'm going to present to you today, which really excitingly is soon to be published in the International Journal of Sport and Society. So myself, Dr. Neil Hall, Leon Keir, Chris Lawrence, we're really grateful to have the platform today to present our work to you. And we really believe that our research brings a new insight into the plight of elite athletes. And we really hope that with your help, we're able to make a valuable contribution and impact on the landscape of education. Now, before I jump into our research and give you the results of our data, I think it's really important to first contextualise why education in sport even matters. Why should you be interested in hearing from us, and what kind of impact are we hoping to make with our paper? And to answer those questions, I'm not going to start where you think I might. I will, of course, talk about health and well-being and transitions out of sport, but I'm actually going to start here by talking about the positive impact of education on performance. So last year, Professor David Lavalley published a paper evidencing the positive impact of education on athletes' performance. He tracked all 632 first grade NRL players over 3 seasons, and he measured them across 25,000 performance indicators to find that, on average, players who were engaged in pre-retirement planning were actually selected more often by their clubs, stayed at one club for a longer period of time, and in fact had longer careers. Now, performance is undeniably at the absolute core business of what sport represents. So, as we all know, if you want to get people's attention when you're having conversations about sport and investing in the different pockets around sport, and particularly off the field, you really need to be thinking about how it's going to result in a performance gain. And now, with Lavalley's research to back up what's long been known anecdotally, we have an evidence-based case for how performance benefits from education. Next, education is good for the brand of sport. You know, we set really high expectations of athletes to uphold a standard of behaviour on the field and off the field. But we have a responsibility to meet that expectation with the right kind of investment, resources, and support. You know, we've created this idea about the off-field professional, right? And we expect athletes to be positive advocates around matters of mental health, violence, substance use, you know, and all of those other markers in which we measure society by. And one of those, of course, is education. And we expect athletes not only to send positive messages around education, but to also be actively engaged in programs as well. Because really the thing is, you know, when we have better ambassadors for sport, we have better representation. And I really believe it's at that point that we become more attractive to our future potential commercial partners. You know, to put it really plainly in black and white, if sport's a business, and we have to be honest, it is, and the conversation's about money, and it often is, then education is just another way of maximising sport's social capital. And lastly, education is critical for athletes' wellbeing. Here's what we know. Australian athletes are overrepresented in certain mental health issues, including generalised anxiety disorder and substance misuse. And we know that an athlete is at their most vulnerable when transitioning out of sport into retirement. And education, or pre-retirement planning, is the most effective early intervention and prevention strategy keeping athletes safe into, through, and out of their sport journeys. You know, you speak to almost any retired player and they'll almost all unanimously say the same thing, that they wish they did more while they were playing. Now, whether your interest in education is motivated by performance, commercial interests, or maybe you feel a genuine sense of duty of care for your athletes, you know, there's a really convincing argument to be made for investing in elite athlete education. Now, of course, a performance focus is always going to be at the centre of elite sporting environments. But research is telling us that this doesn't need to be at the detriment or expense of off-field engagements, but rather advocating for education programs because of its wellbeing, performance, and commercial gains makes for a really logical and effective strategy moving sport forward. So if we know why it's important to empower athletes in education, then our research really takes on that next question. How do we do it, and how do we do it well? So we took a survey to 132 athletes and 36 player development managers across the top 5 major professional sporting codes in Australia. We used qualitative and quantitative data collection methods to capture an insight into their lived experience of education. And we used that information to map the factors that empowered and inhibited their achievement in that space. Now, 2 themes were raised consistently across our results. They were flexibility and the role of the player development manager. And I'll expand on both of these in detail in a moment. But as a general point of summary, when our participants spoke about flexibility, they spoke about tailoring courses and delivery models around the unique needs of athletes. And when they spoke about the role of the player development manager, they spoke about the nature of personal support, empowerment, and some of the spaces of difference between their perspectives. So first, let's kick off by understanding why athletes engage in education. And we started our surveys asking exactly that. What motivates athletes? Now, as you can see from the graph in front of you, transition planning, personal development, these were the 2 factors highlighted as the most significant causal factors. Now, I want to draw your attention to transition planning though, because when we had a closer look at this statistic, we saw that 71% of athletes identified transition planning as a factor that they'd considered prior to engaging in education for the first time. And that was matched by 54% of player development managers. But when we asked what might influence their future engagement, that figure rose to a pretty overwhelming 86% majority. Now, these findings are important for a few reasons. And one is that it suggests to us that sport's doing a really good job of supporting athletes' understanding of the risks associated with retirement. But what I'm concerned about is that it also means education is still strictly understood within that domain of the wellbeing space. We take another look at that original graph, and some of those factors like improving performance are still quite understated by contrast. All right, so the first of our higher order themes, flexibility. So our research was oversaturated with references to this idea of flexibility and the growing need for more flexible practices in delivering education to athletes. So our research really demonstrated this, and we talk about how the unique lives of athletes are at a discord with some of the mainstream education models. And we really make a case for change in that regard. Let's start with course duration. So we asked athletes who were at their discretion, what would be the ideal length of a degree? Their response was that 85% of participants preferred a course within a 12-month cap. And we believe this has a lot to do with the length of sporting contracts, which are typically quite short-termed, and that really means that athletes are not likely to make plans much further than the length of their contract. And there's a few quotes here that support that view. You're not going to get anything over 12 months with the nature of contracts. You don't know where an athlete will be in 2 years. And unsurprisingly, player development managers were in agreement with over half of our participants, specifically noting contract duration as a major barrier for athletes across all of our qualitative data. Now, one of the important implications of this is that athletes are significantly overrepresented in short-term education courses. And for the NRL, it's 71% against 29% when we're talking about formal education enrolments. So this idea that, athletes don't want to study, or worse still, that they don't have the ability to, really needs to be challenged, because it might actually be that the systems and structures that facilitate their education opportunities have significant limitations. And one of those conditions clearly is the nature of contracts and course duration. So let's keep moving while staying within the conversation of flexibility, and we'll have a look at study load. So we asked athletes how much capacity they had to commit to study each week. And on average, that was 7 hours, split 50% self-directed and 50% face-to-face. Now, when we have a look at the expectations of our leading education providers, that's 18 hours per week at TAFE and 40 hours per week at university, which is nearly 6 times that of the athlete's capacity. Now, when we have a look at part-time options, these seem slightly more viable. At a minimum, TAFE expect 3 hours. From university, that's 10. The trouble is, for an athlete to study at that rate, it'd take them 16 years to complete that university degree. Now, sport puts a lot of pressure on athletes to engage in education, and we hold university up as this holy grail of achievement. But at some point, we need to take a step back and ask ourselves how fair and realistic these expectations are. Perhaps further still, we really need to be having the same conversations with our education providers. Okay, last one for flexibility. Let's talk about delivery models. So we asked athletes about their preferred learning environment, and unsurprisingly, face-to-face at the club was given greatest preference. Now, you'll notice here I've highlighted virtual classroom and distance education, because while these are definitely viable options in accommodating greater flexibility to athletes, they also provide the least amount of personal support. And interestingly, when we gave a set of hypothetical scenarios to athletes where we put personalised support in relation to cost, athletes by a landslide preferred the degree that provided more support despite an increase in fees. And we have some quotes here to support that view. We would pay higher if the emphasis is on outcome, being job ready, having opportunities in placement. Money's not an issue for full-time athletes. And these views were shared by 85% of our player development managers. Now, these findings are significant, and they may indicate to us where the future of professional sport is heading. As Professor Lavallee says, when a player is faced with a choice between 2 offers in the near future, a higher salary and less support, or less salary and more support, I predict players will elect to play for the club with the best player support structure. And certainly our research supports this idea. Okay, so what does all of this mean? Well, one, a need for greater support really indicates to us that athletes are struggling to meet the demands of their courses. And again, I'll refer back to those challenges that we've just outlined. And 2, the fact that athletes are prepared to invest more financial resources into their studies means that there is scope to fund tailored programs accommodating for their unique needs. Now, in summary, athletes are starting 2 steps behind their student counterparts, and finding ways to redress the structures and systems that shape their experience is the duty of everyone in this Zoom. Because when we talk about the landscape of elite athlete education, this is really what we're talking about. And when we talk about empowering elite athlete education, this is what we're talking about. All right, let's move on, and we'll go through the second of our major findings, which is the role of the player development manager. Now, throughout our results, both player development managers and athletes spoke of this relationship. Personable, reliable, trustworthy. These were the kind of words they used to describe that relationship. Involved was another, and in fact, 90% of player development managers believed it was important that they be involved in the athlete's education journey. But what is the role of the player development manager in an education context? Well, their descriptions were really twofold, and they often oscillated between what was a task-oriented and administrative position, while also maintaining this identity as an informal personal support that sits outside of that sporting environment. One of the more impressionable findings was that player development managers had a really strong comprehension of empowerment and strengths-based practice. So empowerment, which is defined as the process of becoming stronger and more confident, especially in controlling one's life and claiming one's rights. Now, this is exactly how player development managers perceive the nature of their support. Now, they had this really consistent desire to remove themselves from the success of their athletes and to try to minimize dependence on their support wherever possible. And 2 quotes that really demonstrate that were, "I don't want to be remembered as the support person. I want the athlete to feel that they have achieved it all by themselves. And I want them to know that there's a plan and a pathway that they have come up with." Now, this is important for many reasons, but perhaps most critically, given that 82% of athletes stated that a disassociation with life after sport and not knowing what career path to take was the most prevalent barrier keeping them from engaging in education for the first time. But empowerment-based practice is really the kind of approach that's going to have the most impact in that regard. Perhaps also emphasising the significance of this relationship was that 76% of athletes felt that they'd actually benefit from more support from their player development managers. Of course, though, there were some instances where player development managers and athletes didn't share the same perspectives. Now, when we asked our participants to rank their expectations of education providers, these were a few of the major discrepancies that cropped up. So enjoyment was ranked second most important for athletes, but 8th for player development managers. Pathways into university was 3rd for athletes, but 13th for player development managers. And lastly, athletes expected home study. They placed no home study, 3rd last at 13th, compared to 2nd for player development managers. Now, these differences have implications, and in many ways, they actually kind of mirror the broader stigmas that affect athletes. But as our research really shows, athletes do want to engage in the highest levels of study, but it's because of the nature of their careers that they often can't. You know, athletes work hard, they're resilient, they're passionate, and this is what society really admires the most about them. So we can't afford to overlook or undermine these qualities when they're the athletes' greatest assets, pushing them through the barriers and challenges they face in pursuing their education goals. So what does all of this mean? And how do we start to pull it together and make some strategies moving forward? Well, excitingly, I think this process has already begun with the growth and emergence of this concept around holistic well-being. So that's the idea that the best way to support an athlete is to support the person, you know, the entire person, on the field, off the field, personally, professionally, and through all of that grey space in between. What we're suggesting is a model that fits within this framework, and we've called it the multidimensional needs of the athlete. So as you can see in the diagram, the athlete's experience of education sits at an intersection of all 3 of these interests. So the challenge, of course, is having these departments work together rather than competing for the time and attention of athletes. You know, really understanding that when they work together, they actually benefit from one another. You know, it's about highlighting each other's strengths and universalizing their common characteristics. So we're suggesting this equation is going to help us unlock some of the answers to these challenges. And it's quite academic, so bear with me while I explain it. Now, first, compatibility. This is really about the relationship between sports' various interests. So that's the performance, the commercial, and the well-being. Now, education is in complement to all of these 3 factors. So as long as we're creating clear and substantiated messages about the impact of education, then we're doing a good job about this. And then there's centrality. Now, this is about the degree to which these interests are treated with equal value. So we ask some questions, you know, is there a hierarchy and what takes priority? Now, remember, this isn't about trying to change a performance focus in sport. It's simply about trying to create equal opportunities in all spaces. When compatibility meets centrality, this is how we rebuild the structures of elite athlete education. So let's take a quick look over our key findings and recommendations. 1, mainstream avenues of education are failing to meet the unique needs of athletes. 2, flexibility is key to empowerment. So that's tailored delivery models, study load, and course duration. These are the spaces where that can be achieved. And 3, investing in individual support is needed. And we recommend 1, making the diverse benefits of education in sport common discourse, and 2, designing and delivering athlete-specific education programs. Now, of course, these are not short-term fixes, but we're really in it for the long game because we believe that the most effective way to see sustainable improvement in athletes' education is to change the systems that facilitate it. And we think that this can happen, but first we really need athletes, coaches, administrators, even our education providers all getting on the same page about where we're at. You know, we really believe that athletes are worth our efforts, and we're going to do everything that we can to ensure that athletes are receiving the best education opportunities and outcomes possible. Now, excitingly, we're going to commit the next 3 years of our research to progressing this project. You know, we're going to look at the systems all over the world and find out what fits best here. You know, we'll investigate the education pathways that already exist at TAFEs and universities across Australia, and we're going to measure them up. Are they working? Why and why not? And we'll use that information to lay the groundwork and trial new education pathways that are uniquely designed specifically to athletes to improve transitions out of sport while empowering their performance in it. But that project won't happen out of nowhere. And this project only happened because of the financial backing and ongoing support of the NRL, the PFA, One Wellbeing, and Western Sydney University. And we're really proud to acknowledge them on the publication of this research. And we were proud to speak their names at the International Conference for Professional Association of Athlete Development Specialists 2 weeks ago, hosted online from New York. Now, for everyone else in this Zoom, you really have the same opportunities. And if you want to be involved, talk to us about it. There's a way for everyone to do so. So our contact details are on the screen now. Please take them with you or contact us on LinkedIn. But for now, that's it from me. Thanks so much for being a part of this webinar. But of course, more importantly, thanks for your passion for elite athlete education. And I'll throw back to Chris now, and we'll take some questions.
Thanks so much, Sam. Thanks for sharing all that data and info. I hope everyone really got a lot out of it. Obviously, there's plenty of items there that are obviously known, and this is just the start of our research, as Sam mentioned. We're really passionate about this space and want to dig further to be able to explore some of the other benefits. Right now, we're going to open up the floor for a Q&A, guys. So any questions that anyone might have, throw them in the chat below, and we can direct them anyway at all four of us. Or if there's someone specifically you want to ask about some of the research or some of our experiences, please, guys, we're here to share as much as we can. Again, we're all involved in this space and want to try and help create and empower elite athlete education. So fire away, don't be shy.
Hi Chris, Ian Clayton here from Torrens University. I've had experience many years ago of working in a program called League Football Education back in the UK. And that was for apprenticeship athletes or players at the age 16 to 18 before they really entered into the professional scene. Is that something that you're looking to progress towards from this model of working with that transitioning athlete into retirement? Indeed, the current players at the elite level, and then obviously transferring through to the apprenticeship side of that age range of the athletes at all?
Yeah, look, I'll touch on a little bit and I'll throw it over to Sam and the other guys as well. I think we're trying to look at obviously all three, but I think majority of the research that we're looking at are those full-time athletes, those athletes who have dedicated hours for training and have changing demands and schedules within training. As Sam mentioned it before, a lot of those athletes, particularly, who have short-term contracts in these team-based sports, find it very hard with changing demands, whether that's through playing, say, in the first grade side 1 week into a reserve grade competition where there's different training days, different competition days, whether that's short-term contracts so they're unaware of where they're going to be in the next few years. It's trying to find a model of delivery and flexibility that's going to accommodate all athletes. So it's not going to really segregate those athletes who cannot commit full-time or might have changing demands from week to week. So it's definitely something we are hoping to look at and look at all age groups, both that sort of apprenticeship age coming through. But majority of what we are going to look at is going to be that professional athlete. So once they first come into that professional system. I don't know if Sam or any other guys want to touch on that.
Yeah, I would just add that, like I said, the most effective way of keeping athletes safe into, through and out of sport to get the most out of them, both as people and as players, is this early intervention and prevention model. So the sooner that we can get athletes engaging in education, the better the outcomes are going to be. And I can only really talk on behalf of sort of the program and system that we have at the Parramatta Eels. But in our junior development pathway systems, it's compulsory that athletes are engaging in at least study or work outside of football in order to be eligible to get on the field. And that's just because, just a credit to how seriously we take this kind of wellbeing space.
Thanks, Ian. Thanks, mate.
Thank you.
Hey guys, I'm Matt Murphy. I'm an athlete wellbeing and engagement manager for Olympic sports. Just as an observation, really necessary, important, really great insights from you guys. I think it's important to define what you're talking about in terms of elite versus professional athletes. because obviously elite athletes, Olympic level athletes, have very different experiences and have a different pathway through to obviously elite performance, but also are supported already in lots of these different ways. And I just think it's really important in Australia that we understand the needs of elite athletes versus the needs of professional athletes. And I think within your research, if you could call it professional athletes, it would hit so much more power maybe than just calling elite athletes.
Yeah. And again, that's something we definitely want to explore in our next research project, because the change in demands, and one thing we want to look at is how the demands of, say, athletes with individualized sports versus team sports, you know, in some of the major sporting codes, how do they differ? Because you might have a lot of extra support and funding in these team sports versus, say, Olympic sports or you know, individualized sports where it's solely based on the athlete, and they might have different demands where they can structure it in. So that's something we do want to look at, not only looking at you know, flexibility and tailoring models for athletes, but how does this change depending on the type of sport and the type of organisation you sit within. So I don't know, Sam, or anyone wants to touch on that?
Yeah, there's so many variabilities that we could have taken this research down, and certainly having a closer look at women's experiences in professional sport would bring a whole different suite of challenges. I suppose in the context of this project, we did use the term elite sports simply because that was the demographic that we had involved in the project. So when we looked at the top 5 major sporting codes, our participants were professional elite level athletes, I guess. But that's absolutely an important point to bring up. So thanks for that, Matt.
Cheers, guys.
Thanks, Matt. We've got one come through from Amanda. Said, thanks for the question. I know money is definitely an issue for Olympic athletes, but it would seem it is not the same case professional. I suppose I'll touch on that in a minute. I think it is, but it isn't. I think there is a big discrepancy, I think, with some of the athletes using, say, NRL, for example. You do have, you know, the average wage is quite high. You do have a lot of younger athletes coming through, and while these development athletes are on a good wage compared to, say, a lot of Olympic athletes, we find that cost is still an issue for these athletes who are still having to pay living expenses, fees. Some of these athletes do have young families to support as well. So again, it's one of those things where you know, it's hard to generalise the entire, I suppose, sporting group, but I can definitely you know, sympathise and say that yes, obviously that would be an issue for those Olympic athletes.
I think the other thing there is to consider the length of career. I know Sam raised it during the presentation, but you know, professional sports people in the main have short careers. As Leon said, Chris is one of the exceptions. It's had a significantly long and prosperous career, but others are not in that same boat. So there's a distinction to be made there as well.
Just to address those questions that we've dropped in the chat from Ashley, what are the differences between ethnicities for players? We didn't capture any demographic data in this study, but I can certainly forward on you know, a whole plethora of research that does investigate the different cultural experiences of athletes, and particularly for us in the NRL, having such a huge representation from the Pacific region, and knowing the differences between collectivist cultures and individualist cultures and what that means for the transience of money and things like that. These are all really important considerations to make, and all of this certainly has a place to be discussed within this context of education. As for the second question, how engaged are players in the compulsory education and job criteria at Parramatta? I think that for us, we're in a really unique space in our 20s team, and that our head coach is also our wellbeing manager. So when I talked earlier about this kind of that matrix of compatibility and centrality, he really is able to embody, I guess, the balance between the performance and the well-being, and put these things into one clear and consistent rhetoric. So the players do buy into it because they've got a head coach that really believes in the process and set the structure up in the first place. But I know that at other clubs, it's not as successful. So I think that we're really at the beginning of trying to understand how to create more effective systems that help to blend different interests and agendas around professional sport, But I think it's a really exciting time to be involved in this wellbeing space, and even just the growth over the last 5 years since I've taken an interest has been really big. So thanks for your questions.
Hey guys, it's Mark Ranby here, just from the New Zealand Rugby Players Association. Thanks for putting this together today. I'm really interested in that last point that you make, Sam, around obviously just coaches and how much of an impact they have on the environment. I mean, I just think it's great that you guys are in this space and talking about it more. I've been a personal development manager here in New Zealand in the rugby space for about 8 years, and just moved into the retired space. But yeah, I think, how have you found sort of, I guess, clubs and environments are sort of celebrating the successes of athletes, or, telling the story? Obviously, Chris, you've been working hard in that space, but yeah, do you think, that culture change is happening?
I think that's probably a good question for Chris to answer, having been involved in sport for so long. Chris, if you've noticed any cultural changes within the wellbeing space across the span of your career?
Yeah, I definitely have seen a change, particularly in the last few years. And again, you're still going to get a lot of disparity between different clubs and whether that's the philosophy of the coaches or that particular club, or different sporting codes or organisations. But I think as a whole, having dealing obviously within the NRL and clubs within the NRL, and then working with the other sporting organisations here within Australia, there definitely has been a big shift in the last, say, 5 years, I would say. Again, like anything, you're still not there yet. And I still think, as Sam pointed out before, I still think because it's still that shift in mentality that people see education and wellbeing in terms of career transition. So, again, when it comes to the pointy end of things, and say if a coach or a trainer has to get the best out of an athlete, because all that performance, everyone's job's on the line, the coach's job's on the line, the players, with their position, the team's on the line. If that's not seen as something to improve performance and then get a better outcome for the athlete and the team, then it's not a priority. So I think it's that shift in mindset to show, and hopefully, digging deeper into this space, and from the research from Professor Lavalley, that we can look at, it actually does have, a performance improvement by engaging in education. And for me, talking subjectively, I can definitely attest to that, because I don't believe that I would have been able to have as long a career and consistent. As I mentioned, being an athlete is such a roller coaster. And I think, honestly, particularly in this day and age, when I started, the prevalence of social media wasn't as big. So because it is now, the pressures externally by social media and media are so large that if you can't escape and then can't have another focus, it's very hard to maintain that consistency. And as you would know, elite sport and maintaining and having a longevity career in elite sport is about consistency. So if you can't maintain consistent performance, then you're not going to have a long career. And I've found education has allowed me to have, stay down and have consistent performance. So, that'd be the next step, to try and measure that, from a research perspective. And again, to help have those coaches and shifting the mindset. So that is a priority.
I really appreciate that. Yeah, just great stuff. And I think that obviously the research component that you guys have, embarked on is only going to kind of support and sort of give that, I guess, validity to maybe what's been known. So keep up the great work. Thanks.
So I've got another question here from Ben. So just saying, thanks so much for the seminar. Fantastic stuff. I'm wondering if you feel it might matter what type of areas of study athletes are undertaking, as in it would matter if they were studying communications or business as opposed to social work or some fitness-related course. Are there any concerns or strengths about the courses they choose and the likelihood of successful career beyond sport? Cheers, Ben. Yeah, that's obviously something, you can't have, a completely tailored program for someone who wants to be a doctor, for example. They obviously would still have to go through the requirements of to become a doctor. But again, a lot of what we have sort of highlighted is just looking at what can be feasible in terms of the average NRL athlete. For those who across the board want to engage. And we looked at some of the numbers. Obviously, there's going to be certain types of athletes which are going to have the organisation or have the capacity to be able to engage in more study load or higher hours, which can then fit into some of these things. So I I think, I don't know if you want to elaborate more on that, Sam.
Yeah, sure. This is something that we will take on board over the next 3 years, and the next iteration of this project is getting involved in some of the more nuanced factors that exist within this discussion. But what we do know, I guess, coming into this point is that, as I said, athletes are overrepresented in short-term education courses, and that's 71% of education courses are within a 12-month period at the moment. And of those courses, the three most popular are fitness-related certificates and diplomas, social work, community welfare-related studies, and business. But that's a really, really excellent pickup, Ben. So thanks for that, mate.
I think what we're also particularly seeing is that amongst the Indigenous and Pacific Island communities, that youth work, community work is a very popular option. So that's something that we'd like to dig down a bit deeper into as well.
Sorry, if I don't mind, I'll just take the chance to ask this final question, if I may. I have had some experience of working with the Roosters, and a particular player from the Roosters we were working with a couple of years ago. They fell by the wayside because their commitments to the sport and, other priorities at the time of competition, depending on getting to the finals and things like that, it derailed their studies somewhat. One thing I'm wondering is if a university or college or whoever the provider is giving that education, what can they do better to support a small number of athletes in a club or organisation? I mean, I know they can provide flexible learning, they can support obviously the PDM, etc. But I'm trying to think of the way in which they might schedule activities with a small number of athletes, knowing that it's got to be business viable for the university and college as well, etc.
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think that's what a lot of the issues is. It's those competing priorities. With these education providers, again, versus with the priorities of, say, the club or the coaches and then the athletes. It's trying to find, okay, what's the balance between the three? I think in terms of that example, and one thing, when we talk about flexibility, it's because it's not just flexibility in terms of times of days that they can go and attend certain classes. It's the fact that from week to week, particularly within team sports, an athlete's demands can significantly change. One week they might be playing first grade and training on these days. The next week they're now playing reserve grade and training at night when they got more time. The following week they could be injured and going to get surgery. So to be able to have flexible learning that can literally change from week to week to week to suit what their needs are from week to week, I think that's where the challenge lies and where some of the solution lies. But again, that is to try and find that it's trying to have a balance of priorities between all parties.
Thanks, Chris.
Thanks, Sam. Okay, great, guys. Well, thank you so much for everyone for jumping on. I know it's a busy time for everyone, so we really appreciate everyone taking the time here. If anyone has any other questions, you've got all of our details up there, and I'm sure we'll follow up with some emails with our details again. So if there's anything else that you haven't shared or any questions you might have later on you think of, please send an email through. And as Sam mentioned, we're really committed and passionate about really diving deeper in the next 3 years. So if you've got any questions or want any more information about where we're heading with that, please shoot us through some information. So I also want to thank all our presenters. Thank you to Sam, Neil and Leon for sharing your stories. It really puts things in, gives a number of perspectives to show, how passionate we are all about this space. So thank you again, guys. We look forward to being in touch with every one of you soon. Cheers. Have a good day.